Welcome everyone to the first lecture for General Zoology. I would much rather be doing this in person, but gotta work with what we have. So this is a recorded lecture for what is an animal. Now the creature that you see here on this first page is a giant barrel sponge. They can get 6 feet wide in diameter. They live in the Caribbean in coral reef environments. And they can live up to 2,000 years. Pretty cool creatures. When you think about animals, you probably don't think about things like giant barrel sponges. You probably think more about something like this brown bear that you see up in the corner of that slide. But zoology, as a study, is going to encompass both of those creatures and everything in between. So zoology, if you break the word down, ology as a suffix, it comes from a Greek word that means logos, which means word, but we are going to think of ology as being a suffix that basically means the study of something. And then zoo means animals. So the study of animals. Straightforward. What we need to do, and what we'll be doing here today, is defining what it means to be an animal. But animals themselves, and zoology as a discipline, is one part of a broader field, which I'm sure you've heard of, which would be biology. Because we know that animals are one type of living thing. Right? You know that. Biology, if you break down the word bio, means life. So the study of life. So biology is broad. That includes the study of plants, fungi, bacteria, lots of specific groups of living organisms. We are interested specifically in one group, that would be our animals. So zoology falls within the realm of biology, and biology is the study of life. Before we get into specifically defining what it means to be an animal, I think it's important that we determine what all living things have to do to be considered life. And if we were doing this in person, what I usually do is ask the class to give me examples of characteristics shared by all living things. So in your head, you can kind of mull that around for a couple seconds if you want. But if we were doing this in person, that's what I would do. So let's go ahead then and look through the things you have to do to be considered a living organism. Keep in mind that these features are going to apply not just to our animals, but also to plants, fungi, and even little bacteria. So what are the characteristics of life? Let's start with cells. So I'm going to put this up here. Characteristics of life. The first characteristic that's usually given to define life is that it's built from cells. In fact, the definition for the cell that's usually given is the fundamental unit of life, or the building block of life, either one. That's not really descriptive. If you want to get technical, a cell is usually a membrane that surrounds semi-fluid with a bunch of structures called organelles that do different jobs. Don't worry about that right now. You're going to think about cells as the building blocks or the fundamental units of life. This picture here is showing a microscope slide, magnified, of somebody's cheek cells that have been stained. And this is one cell right here. You can see the nucleus at the center. You can see this is called the cytoplasm. That's the semi-fluid interior of the cell. So these are the cells that line your cheeks. They're called squamous epithelial tissue cells. But all animals, all living things, plants, animals, fungi, all of it, they're all built from cells. And so if it's not made of cells, it's not considered a living thing. So characteristic number one, built from cells. Characteristic number 2, development guided by DNA. So I'm sure all of you have heard of DNA at some point. What it stands for is deoxyribonucleic acid. And what I like to think of it as is the language that's used to ultimately build living things. So how it works is inside of a cell, in the nucleus of that cell, you've got a certain amount of DNA, and within that DNA, you're going to have specific genes, and a gene is going to be one segment of your DNA that determines something about you. So all living things use the language of DNA molecules as the thing that guides how they're built. If you look at your cells, you've got, within just one of your cells, you've got all of your DNA with all of your genes that ultimately determine how you are built. Over here we've got some fruit flies, and they have a lot less DNA in each of their cells than you do, but they've got a certain number of genes, and those genes use the same language that your body uses with DNA, and then those genes ultimately guide the development of the fruit fly. I put the fruit fly up there because they've historically been used for a lot of genetic studies because they have really easily identifiable features that are linked with specific genes, and you can breed them really quickly. I think they live like a couple weeks. Their generation time is really short. So they've been used in a lot of genetic studies, and so that's why they're up there. But everything from bacteria to you uses the same language of DNA as the blueprint for ultimately building each organism up. So having DNA to guide development is another feature of all living things. Living things can pass on that DNA to the next generation, and that's going to be feature number 3 for characteristics of life, reproduction. There are 2 different methods. Our 3-toed box turtles here are demonstrating the method that is used by animals predominantly, which is sexual reproduction. With sexual reproduction, there's 2 parents. You have sperm and egg cell which fuse, and then the offspring ultimately are a mix of the genes of both parents, and so they're genetically distinct from either of their parents. You do not have exactly the same DNA as your biological mother or your biological father. You've got some from each of them. So sexual reproduction is the dominant method in animals. There's also asexual reproduction, which I think is on this. It's on the next slide, so we'll get to that. But sexual reproduction is the dominant method used by animals, but asexual is used by bacteria, and some animals, some plants. Another feature of life is harvesting energy. So I've got a rabbit pictured over there. A rabbit, and it's actually eating a carrot, so very stereotypical here. But a rabbit like you, like every other living thing, has cells that need to do stuff, to do work. And if your cells need to do work, they need a source of energy to do that work. And there's 2 major ways you can get that. You can use the sun to produce your own food and then burn that for energy, like plants do. Or you can be like you are and I am, and we're incapable of doing that, so we have to eat stuff to get our energy. That rabbit as well would have to consume for its energy. But whether you're a plant, an animal, a fungus, however you get it, you're going to find a way to get energy so your cells can do work. And we'll talk more about how animals do that, I think, in a couple slides. The next feature for life is maintaining homeostasis. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this creature. This is called the ocean sunfish. It is the largest fish on Earth that has a bony skeleton. So basically, not including sharks. I don't have any exact figures for how big they can get, but they're really goofy looking fish if you ever see them. These fish live in the ocean. Ocean water is about 3.5% salt, and we'll talk about osmosis later on here. Water moves in and out of fish depending on how salty their environment is. These guys live in a salty ocean environment, and so their body has to maintain a certain amount of water-salt balance in order to ensure that they don't gain or lose too much water while they're in the ocean. You have to maintain homeostasis. You have to maintain homeostasis as well. Your body temperature, for example, is kept around 97 to 98 degrees Fahrenheit. We'll get into all of these things here in a little more detail in a bit. I have a sunflower pictured up here just to point out again that all of these features can be shared not only by animals but also by plants and fungi and every other living thing. So these are not defining of animals but defining of life in general, to which, of course, animals belong. And I did not want to do that. There we go. Now let's look at, real quickly, kind of classifying where animals belong in this tree of life. So, we have an entire PowerPoint dedicated to taxonomy in a couple weeks. This is just going to be a very basic introduction to the concept. Let's say you have an organism. You're trying to figure out what it is. All right, we'll just say that it's organism X, right? They use planet X for an unknown planet. So this is organism X. We don't know what it is. We want to figure out what it is. We're going to classify it. So to classify organisms, you have to start out with a very broad level of classification called the domain level. I like to think of it as picking doors to classify something in. Organism X can go into one of these three doors depending on its characteristics. The first two domains are called bacteria and archaea. You've heard of bacteria, you may have heard of archaea. These two both are single-celled organisms. They're small. They're what's called prokaryotic or prokaryote organisms. That means that they don't have a nucleus. So if organism X has cells with no nucleus, that means that organism X can go into one of these domains. Let's assume that organism X has a nucleus in its cell or cells. That would put it in our third domain, which is called eukarya. Eukarya is going to be any living thing that has a nucleus within its cells. So cells have a nucleus. Animals, as you might expect, are going to fall into this domain. All animals have cells with a nucleus. Once we've figured that out, we go through this door. Our next door to choose is one of the four kingdoms that fall within eukarya. And this is where we are now specific enough to define, or I should say, isolate animals. So we have plants, that's one of our kingdoms, as this cardinal flower here represents. Animals, like our cat. Fungi, like our morel mushrooms. And then the fourth kingdom is what I call the junk drawer of kingdoms. If it's something that doesn't fit into a plant, animal, or fungus kingdom, throw it into the protist kingdom. So, organism X, we've determined that it's eukarya because it has a nucleus. Now we have to sort it into one of the four kingdoms. What is the criteria to find out if organism X is an animal? Well, that's the main point of this lecture today, so let's dive into what you have to have in order to be considered, or what you have to do in order to be considered an animal. Characteristics of animals. So for our organism X to be in the animal kingdom, what features must it show? Let's take a look. First thing to look at is how many cells is it built from? You are built from trillions of cells. Many animals are built from trillions of cells. But all you have to be multicellular is two. Multicellular, multi meaning two or more, and then cellular, of course, meaning cells. Just have to have more than two cells and you are multicellular. If you go back to this slide, the protists, the junk drawer, a lot of them are single-celled. They're not animals. However, historically, they always get lumped into zoology classes anyway. So just FYI, we're going to be looking at them later on. But to be an animal, you have to be multicellular. I think I got a picture up here. Yeah, this is showing an example of a multicellular animal, which is a sponge, and a single-celled protist. It's called an amoeba, little blob, basically. But this is not an animal. That is, part of the reason for that is that the sponge has more than one cell. We already mentioned that animals have cells that are eukarya or eukaryotic. So I'll just put that word up again here because you're going to run into it a lot. Eukaryotic meaning that animal cells have a nucleus within them. And this picture is showing the lining of an animal's digestive tract. This is where the food, what's left of the food, is going to be traveling down, and then nutrients would be absorbed through these cells, and you can see that these cells have a nucleus. One thing animal cells do not have is cell walls. If you look at an animal cell, here we are. So there's our nucleus. The fluid interior of the cell here, this is called the cell's cytoplasm. The outside of the cell is called the cell membrane. That is your stereotypical animal cell. If you look at a plant cell, they've got the same stuff, but they've got something else around the outside. A reinforcing cell wall. That's plant, and this is animal. Mushrooms, fungi also have cell walls. Many bacteria have cell walls. The fact that animals don't have them is actually a pretty defining feature of them. So not having cell walls. We'll look later at how this influences cellular structure, but this is from an onion peel, and you can really see how the cell walls give the plant cells that rigid look, whereas animal cells don't have that. We mentioned reproduction. as one of the features of life. I do just want to now distinguish a little bit more between asexual and sexual reproduction. So, sexual reproduction is the dominant method that animals use. Features of that are two parents, and the offspring that get made from the sperm and egg cells from those parents are going to be unique from either parent. Like I said, you are not identical to your biological mother or father. You are a mix of both, genetically speaking. So for sexual reproduction, as these little damselflies are showing here, two parents, genetically unique offspring. Asexual reproduction is usually used by single-celled creatures, where that single cell will use what's called binary fission and split like this. That's the group that uses it most commonly, but some animals have ways of doing this too. With asexual reproduction, there's one parent, and that parent produces offspring that are genetically identical. Basically, it clones itself. That's how you can think about it. Here's an example of an animal that is able to use asexual reproduction. Most starfish or sea stars cannot do this, but a few of them can. It can be in response to being injured, but for some of them, they seem to use it as an actual strategy for asexual reproduction, where the starfish will either lose an arm or will be split. The instructions, the information to be able to build a full new body is found in part of this central region here called the central disc. And if the information that is needed is there, if it's broken off and enough of that central disc remains to have the information there, then even just one of these legs can give rise to 4 new ones and create a new starfish. So basically, you start off with this. You lose a leg, like that, and if enough of that central disc remains, I believe the official term for this is a comet. If enough information remains and conditions are right, a new sea star can form as those legs grow. And then the original one can also regrow its legs. So you end up with 2 starfish, genetically identical to each other, that came from one parent, ultimately splitting off with a leg. Most of the times when starfish do lose a leg like this, this doesn't happen. It usually dies. There's usually an infection or something happens where this doesn't work. But it can work, and when it does, it is asexual reproduction. It takes almost a year for them to fully regrow, by the way. So it's not like a quick, easy process. One of the features of life was using energy. Animals are what's called heterotrophs. You may or may not have heard of this word before, but animals are specifically a consuming heterotroph. Heterotroph, troph means feeding. Hetero means other or another. So feeding on others. That is a pretty apt description of what it means to be a heterotroph. You need energy, and you going and standing in the sun won't get you the energy that you need. A plant plant has specialized structures called chloroplasts, which allow it to take carbon dioxide in the air and convert that stuff into organic sugars, which is food, source of energy. To do that, which is called photosynthesis, you need chloroplasts. You need green pigment in those chloroplasts. I'm going to guess that none of you are green right now. You can't do that. You have to get your energy by consuming stuff that has already done that, or consuming stuff that consumes stuff that already did that. You get the point. So you are a consumer, right? The alternative, by the way, plants like that willow tree, what they do, they are called autotrophs. Troph means feeding. Auto, you may recognize it from the word automobile. Auto means self, self-feeding. So autotrophs, plants, algae, green stuff, they're able to take carbon dioxide, convert it into organic sugars. And actually, I lied. That looks like a willow. It is not. That is a eucalyptus tree, because I have the koala as our heterotroph. Eucalyptus trees are autotrophs. They take sunlight, use it to convert CO2 to sugars. Our koala over there cannot do that. So they sit in the eucalyptus tree and eat leaves all day to get energy. With life, homeostasis was mentioned as a feature of life. This does apply to all living things, but I want to look at a couple ways in which homeostasis applies specifically to animals. The most common way that it's understood to apply is with temperature. So I've got two examples here. I've got a white-tailed deer and a red-eared slider turtle. So let's just put here the deer. You tend to see deer active all winter long. That's because deer are what's called endotherms. You may know this term as meaning warm-blooded. Endo means inside or within. Therm means temperature. An endotherm is going to be an organism that generates body heat using its metabolism inside its body. So heat is generated by the metabolism inside its body. This is what you do, this is what mammals and birds do. It means that you don't have to go sit out in the sun to raise your body temperature to 98 degrees. Our turtle, on the other hand, is a reptile. It is an example of an ectotherm. Ecto meaning outside. If you've ever had a pet reptile, you may have had to give it a heat lamp to replicate sun, solar radiation, that heat source. Also, these creatures, these ectotherms, they'll get heat from the sun, they'll sit on a rock and get conductive heat from that rock that they're sitting on. Point is, they have to use outside sources of heat to regulate their body temperature. But both of these are still regulating it, and that is a form of homeostasis. One other homeostasis example that I want to use is the balance of water and salt. So I've got what's called a long-ear sunfish on the screen there. When people go fishing for sunfish, they usually catch bluegills. People don't usually catch these guys. But I want to quickly go over one example of maintaining homeostasis. That is really light. I don't think you can see that. How about purple? That's also really light. Let's use the black marker. So, here's our hypothetical sunfish right there. So, long-eared sunfish, they live in Missouri, streams and ponds, and our water is fresh, which means that the amount of salt in it is 0 or it's negligible. In terms of how salt gets measured in water, it's measured in what's called parts per thousand, which is shortened to PPT. So fresh water is going to be 0 parts per thousand. Our fish is swimming in water that has virtually no dissolved salts. The fish's body itself, just like your body, is built from a lot of water, and the cells and tissues of the fish have more salt in them than the water in which it swims. We're going to say that inside of our fish, it's about 5 parts per thousand of salt within its body tissues. The gills are really thin so that the fish can get oxygen, but they're thin enough that water can go in and out of our fish. And as it turns out, water really likes more salt. So H2O, water, is going to move into the fish attracted to the salt. We're going to talk way more about this later on, so if the details of this aren't making sense, don't fret about that. I just want you to be aware more than anything that our fish in fresh water has to deal with not absorbing too much water and not bloating from too much water. So in fresh water, these fish absorb salt in their gills, through their gills, and they expel a lot of dilute, basically watery urine all the time to help expel the water that they're gaining. Point is, they got to maintain that balance. Ocean fish have the opposite problem. Ocean birds have a problem as well. If you or I were to drink seawater, we would die because our body would lose water trying to dilute and get rid of all that salt, so we'd actually become more dehydrated as we drank it. Seabirds, like this gull, this seagull right here, they have salt glands right up here, and those glands help absorb and remove salt from the bloodstream, and then they actually can spray it out through their beak, or through these nostrils on their beak, to get rid of excess salt. So water-salt balance, temperature, there's many others. Your blood has to maintain pH. There's a lot of different things that have to go on here. So homeostasis, another feature that you observe in all animals. We haven't gotten to the biggest one yet, and the one that most people think of when they think of animals. I want to go back, all the way back to the very beginning, right here. The giant barrel sponge. So if I were to ask you what is the primary difference between an animal and a plant, I'm thinking most of you would say it's this. The difference is the movement. Animals move. Plants, they might respond to sunlight, they might move a little bit in their fixed place, but they don't move from point A to point B. Animals do. At least the vast majority of them sure seem to. Then you got things like the sponge, which lives for 2,000 years and does not move. So is movement a feature that is shared by all animals? The answer might actually surprise you. The answer is answer is yes, all animals can move at some point in their life. Sponges have a larval stage. That larva moves. All animals at some point in their life can move. Of course, we have a couple of extremes we'll look at first. The fastest land animal, cheetahs, up to 70 miles an hour. The fastest animal period is actually the peregrine falcon, which can fly over 200 miles an hour. You have slow-moving animals like our sloth. I've got an actual number here. Let's see. 41 yards per day. 120 feet per day on average movement. Not a lot of movement. Most animals can move throughout their life, like our cheetah and our sloth. Some of them cannot. These little creatures are called tunicates. Like our sponge, they don't move when they're an adult. They just stay fixed. Another example of a creature like that would be a barnacle, something like that. Here's one of those tunicates as a larva. It's got a tail. It can move. So all animals can move at some point in their life. Part of what makes animals so successful at movement is some of their tissues that they possess that other organisms don't possess. For example, nervous systems, skeletal muscle, other contractile tissues. Not all animals have all of this, of course, but it's things like that that allow animals to be so successful in movement. And I have a picture up there of my two pets. So I live in an apartment. My landlord straight up told me I could not have anything that was free-ranging, no cat, no dog, so it has to be in a tank. So my first request was for a snake. That was not well received, so I needed another plant. After doing some research, I settled on gerbils. Those are my two gerbils, and the reason why I have them up there is I figured to end this lecture, we would just look at all of the features shared by all animals and see if these guys fit the bill. If you're not familiar with gerbils, they're rodents that were actually not domesticated until the 1950s. They were used as lab rats in Japan, and scientists found out that, hey, these things are pretty calm and don't bite a lot, pretty friendly, and so we've kept them as pets, and they stopped using them as lab rats. So I love them, they're great little pets. But these two guys, their names are Pumpkin and Waffles, and let's see, they're made up of cells, check. Multicellular, yep. Reproduce, they do. Those two will not. They are sisters. They will not reproduce. Fun thing about gerbils is that they're actually monogamous. They mate with one partner for life. It takes them about 70 days to mature from birth to adult gerbils. Sadly, they only live for like 3 years. These guys are just turned 2. They just turned 2. Heterotrophs, yes. They love raisins and oats and peanuts. Those are their favorites, but they eat a lot of stuff. Their hearts beat 360 times per minute. Their body temperature is warmer than ours. They have a high metabolism. They're eating a lot. They're moving a lot. They have to maintain a consistent body temperature. They use homeostasis. And, like I said, they obviously move quite a bit, as you'll see with the short little video I'm going to end this lecture with.